Our students are hurting.
Us alumni are hurting.
Our community comes from around the world.
And injustice.
And the climate crisis.
Is reaching us around the world.
In Houston.
In New Orleans.
In Lexington, Massachusetts.
Because of Stanford's action.
And because of Stanford's
inaction.
Refusing to hold big oil accountable.
Stanford is invested in Exxon.
Chevron.
Stanford takes money from
Aramco.
BP.
We call for no more.
No more.
No more. We want
An end to the greenwashing.
We want
an end to the complacency.
We want
a fossil-free education.
we want.
a true school of sustainability.
We want.
a fossil-free Stanford. Today we're going to show you stories
from the students that Stanford is hurting.
So that you can learn from them.
So that we can build solidarity.
So that you can join the call.
To make Stanford
Fossil-free.
Fossil free!
Fossil free!
Yeah, I'm Maya, Maya Green. I study urban studies and education here, class of 24, so about to graduate. And yeah, I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. I know that's a question.
Hi, my name is Lily Joy. I'm a Dinet and Southern Youth activist and a junior at Stanford. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I would say home for me is Dinet Bikea, which is the Navajo Nation. In Albuquerque, it was very beautiful in that there's so many brown people, so many Native people. It's a minority-majority state, and so I was really grateful to be surrounded by so many different cultures, but also so many Native people. I think it was able to really ground me.
My name is Belinda Ramirez. I was raised in Southern California in the LA area. So I grew up in sort of the suburbs of Los Angeles, outside to the east. It was hugely suburban. LA, just really, really busy, a lot of traffic all of the time.
Charleston is so interesting. I feel like it's like simultaneously like kind of on people's radar. First shots of the Civil War, I feel like people associate it with that. But they also, especially here, get it really confused with Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's not like people like really know what it is or what it's about. I would say, I guess thinking about it from an urban studies perspective, it's a peninsula, so it's right on the coast of South Carolina. There are two rivers that go around it, and then hurricanes are also really big. So I, even over the course of my life, like the frequency picked up a lot. So I remember like being like kind of aware, like the big Charleston hurricane is Hurricane Hugo, which was in 1989. So I feel like that was like the hurricane on everyone's mind. So there were still, people were really touchy about hurricanes still when I was growing up. But it wasn't until I was like middle school, high school, where it started being like every year a major hurricane, and so like evacuating like every fall, or like to the point where you get kind of desensitized. There are still horse-drawn carriages that like kind of take people on historic tours around the city. And it gets so hot in the summer that like inevitably always like a horse collapses, and then it's like a big animal rights issue. Like, why are we doing this in 2020s? But yeah, it really is very historic, and I feel like that history is like in your face. But then for a lot of my time growing up there, I feel like the history was something that like gave it like Southern charm and like, you know, kind of pastel buildings and like very cute. But it's like a really horrific racial history. Like, the city was built by slavers.
It is a desert, for sure. So it's very dry, I would have to say. But I love the desert. I really do. I think that a lot of, specifically conservationists and environmentalists, don't focus a lot on the desert because it's not the ocean or marine life or forestry. And I think that people really ignore the beautiful biodiversity that's within the desert and all the desert has to offer.
If you've been to Southern California before, it's very hot, sunny, which is an advantage in some ways. Though, and perhaps this is because of some stuff that I've been listening to lately, there were a lot of fires too. So I was remembering recently just the frequency with which we would have class and there would be a sort of ash falling from the sky. Yeah, classes, I don't know if were ever canceled. They might have been at some point, but I remember one particular bad wildfire season where we were going to class, and for us, and for me, not really understanding how all these things, how it was sort of not a good thing to have this be happening. It was sort of a novelty. So we were sort of excited about it, but looking back, it's very awful in a variety of ways. But we would go in and there were like, was a layer of ash on sort of the textbooks and on the desks that, in our classrooms. And I guess, yeah, it was kind of hard. But again, it's sort of a novelty at the time.
My dad's family is from Barbados in the Caribbean, and so like went every few years growing up back to the island. And I specifically remember being on a boat with my uncle when I was pretty young, and he's a civil engineer, and so I was just kind of talking to him. Don't know like how the topic came up, but that's like the first time I remember learning about climate change and about like carbon dioxide growing in the atmosphere specifically, because I remember he like used this analogy to describe what would happen to the oceans if there was too much carbon dioxide in the air, and he was like, yeah, it would be like Coca-Cola, like the oceans are going to turn into Coca-Cola. And I was like, oh my goodness. The ocean is something I grew up around, seeing as Charleston's on the coast, so like kind of like having that visual of like what this invisible, like how this invisible gas that he said was growing could like kind of change my environment very visibly. Like I remember thinking a lot about fossil fuels after that. The ocean is something I grew up, remember like thinking about cars and like how could we like create like a car that ran on a plant and like put out oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. Like I feel like maybe like having it being introduced to me by an engineer, like thankfully I was kind of like thinking about it in a solutions oriented way, like it wasn't just something totally scary.
I didn't hear the word specifically climate change till later on, but I understood what climate change was through seeing the ways that my lands are being impacted. Lake Powell, which is nearing the part of reservation that my family grew up, has been drying up. Severe drought has been going on, and so I don't think I had the words specifically fossil fuels and specifically climate change, but I had an understanding that the ways that we were operating the world were having negative effects on our climate.
At the beginning of grad school is when I first heard of fossil fuels. Coming from a very conservative background, I was in the LDS Church for a little while and was at BYU for my undergraduate. So that wasn't something, at least with the folks that I was around, that people talked about. And again, for my family, being sort of quote apolitical and fairly conservative too, that wasn't something that we ever talked about. In grad school is when I started realizing and was being taught about how the world works a bit more, and became aware of political and vested interests from different corporations, how it was influencing sort of people's everyday experiences, shaping our choices. My particular research is on the food industry, mostly urban agriculture, but around the food system as a whole. And I want to say that my coming into understandings around environmentalism, around climate change, happened via the food lens or the food pathway. And how corporate interests and government interests really shape our food preferences and choices. It was the same exact thing with fossil fuels and climate change.
Growing up in a city that like, where like, yeah, the environmental and the social issues are both so present, like it was really clear to me that you couldn't like separate those two things out from one another. And that, yeah, I think just like this kind of perspective that like environmentalism like as this kind of like colorblind concern for the environment was like something for white people, like made me more drawn to like this lens of environmental justice, because like I could see the ways that like the climate would have like a really disproportionate impact on my community, and like just like knew it was so important to like have a lens and like have like a messaging angle that like spoke to the concerns of those communities. Downtown like used to be way more black than it was, like kind of like before I was born. There was a lot of gentrification occurred that like moved black people from like more lucrative waterfront properties or like proximity to the ocean towards like more inland. But now as like those waterfront properties become increasingly unlivable, you can see kind of like a second wave of gentrification as people realize, oh, we need to back up from the water, thus like further displacing like those black communities. Agency over where you live like feels really important to me, and like I think I've just like watched the ways like housing and race and like climate kind of intersect in Charleston to like make it so that some people like have total agency over where they live and other people are just totally subject to the whims of those people.
As I've become older and become really interested specifically at the intersection of sexual violence against Native women and gender-based violence against Native people and fossil fuels, it's just become more of a pressing issue to me. Extractive industries, as I like oil, like lithium mining as well, are sites of violence for Native people. Like land is being desecrated, and so sacred sites are being desecrated oftentimes. But there also is very like tangible links to the missing murdered Indigenous people epidemic and the fossil fuel industry. Wherever there are man camps, which is this slang term for where there are groups of men, typically non-native, are encamped near native lands working on an extractive industry, we know that those are hotspots of violence against Native women, against Native people. These are spots where we know Native women are more likely to go missing. We know Native women are more likely to experience sexual violence. We know Native women are more likely to be murdered. Big Oil knows that we have a vested interest in climate, and Big Oil knows that we are invested in protecting our climate, so they have a vested interest in destroying us. And they've done this in multiple of ways. Recently there was Brackeen versus Holland. Like, why would this giant like representing firm have any interest in like adoption, foster care? And it's because this was a calculated move from Big Oil to attack our communities, attack our families. The link between like fossil fuels and the degradation of Indigenous people is not just coincidental, like it's intentional at this point. And they know we're a serious threat, and that's why they attack us.
So my relationship with fossil fuel companies now is sort of a negative one, I would say. I see the companies as I do with other corporations that I just mentioned, say like food industry, junk food industry, fast food industry, processed foods in general, all being used, the power behind those interests being used to shape people's ideas of what is normal, basically. And I think that other corporations are doing that too, whether that's in pharmaceuticals or food or fossil fuels. It's all the same sort of playbook that people are using to create markets that may not have existed otherwise. So I look at those companies now with a disdain, honestly, as folks that are trying to protect the bottom line and protect their profit more than they are protecting human sort of well-being, you know, and the future of our species, the future of the planet around us. LA is a wonderful example of this sort of awful phenomenon, I think. It's really hard going back home now because the apoliticization of everything to like sort of non-politicize things is, I think, very robust in a place like that. City centers and big cities tend to be spaces where people aren't encouraged to think about politics and how their actions impact other people or how they're being manipulated by corporations, by government, etc. It's about consumption instead. And city spaces, well, corporations like fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies really profit off of people not thinking too much about where anything comes from. Water, food, the gasoline that comes out of the pump, etc. I remember the pumps, for instance, the ones that go up and down. Those, my siblings and I would always think about those as dinosaurs growing up, and that we've created a narrative and an imagination around this infrastructure for oil and gas extraction is hilarious and very sad, I think, that it was so naturalized for us. This person next to me was also saying the same, like, oh, we always thought about this dinosaur. So this is a common experience for people who grow up around spaces where it's just normal, And that's really sad, I think, to have something so deleterious to our health, so negative for our health, be so normalized. I care very much about taking care of the people around us. I think that's a value that we should strive for as a human species, as a people. So much of our human history points at the opposite and sort of a dog-eat-dog mentality. And I really don't think that that's the way that the world has to be, or that our cultures have to be. And so any sort of injustice, any sort of especially unequal treatment of people, because you wouldn't see those oil pumps in wealthy neighborhoods, for instance. You wouldn't see them in particular areas, particular cities. But you do see them in low-income spaces. You do see them in black and brown neighborhoods. You do see them in places where people already are struggling just to survive. And to me, that's messed up. That's just just obviously very wrong. And yet that's what our world is functioning on. That's what my use of fossil fuels to drive my car down the street to the grocery store has a role in that. And I don't like having to be complicit in a system that I didn't create and I don't agree with. And that's actually actively harming people, not just in urban settings in the US, but all across the world.
Having grown up in South Carolina, I really wanted to go someplace more progressive. I think I was a little bit disillusioned by that image was kind of challenged. One, just I entered Stanford really weirdly, it was the pandemic. Didn't really graduate from high school, then didn't really start Stanford freshman year. So weird transition that just kind of left me feeling more off kilter than probably the normal off-kilterness of starting school. And then I think being here, it just felt specifically the outsized impact of tech in Silicon Valley. I knew Stanford was a CS school, but I didn't think I really knew what that meant. And then I feel I got here and it just felt probably if you polled the university, everyone would think climate change is bad, racism is bad. It's probably a very small minority that wouldn't say those things, but then I feel these kind of loose, not that clearly defined or thought about values didn't really seem to be showing up in the way people thought about internships or thought about the way they wanted to live after school. And so I think it wasn't until I really sought out kind of affinity groups, or I've lived in a co-op this year. I feel my Stanford experience has been one of found urban studies. I feel kind of curating my Stanford within this broader Stanford that had people that kind of talked the talk and walked the walk too. And that made it a lot easier to just get value out of my classes and feel I was getting an education for something, something beyond myself. But yeah, I think I was a little disappointed with how easy it seemed to kind of come through Stanford, go into Stanford with the goal, articulated or not, to just kind of make as much money as possible, and then go through the university without that goal ever really being challenged. I don't think the one weighs engaging diversity diversity and power so they're going to do it. So yeah, I think like my like Stanford hot take exiting it is that like this place really feels like a brand. Like it feels like a place to like accumulate money and resources and like very smart people, but for like their own kind of like institutional benefit, and that they're more concerned with like kind of like greenwashing themselves or like kind of projecting an air of like we care about the world, but only to like attract more people and more resources so that they can like keep doing self-serving things. And so I think like seeing divestment from any number of things, but you know we can talk about fossil fuels specifically here, like seeing divestment would like challenge that. Like
I think that Stanford has a lot to do in terms of making good on its investment to students and investment in the environment. And we know this because they're investing in things that are actively harming my people, our people, other communities that like my people come from, that other indigenous communities come from, aren't being protected. Like, it's unfair and it's disingenuous in a lot of ways, and I hope Stanford steps up to the plate and starts protecting students holistically.
So I fell in line with the Coalition for a True School of Sustainability, folks, mostly grad students and undergrads who were already well sort of embedded within this new school as it was coming online, and realizing that there was this huge and stark contrast between the mission of the new school and what they were purporting to be about and what they were actually doing. One of the things being taking fossil fuel or research money from fossil fuel companies to do all kinds of research that doesn't really get us toward a more sustainable future. And in a funny way, that was the most grounding experience I had had about a year or so into being here at Stanford. It was what made me feel really rooted to the place, was joining others in a sense of advocacy and activism for something that I believed in, which is doing research and caring about our environment and teaching others about that, and wanting to make it better. I love that there's a school of sustainability. I just think it has to be approached and directed in the right kinds of ways. It's to be asking the right kinds of questions and addressing the right kinds of problems, rather than turning a blind eye to the very systems that need to change in order to create a more just future.
I think they have probably told themselves a story of like change from the inside or whatever that like makes the heinous things they're doing to the world more like palatable and like easier to sleep at night. And so yeah, and I think because they probably don't feel evil to like be met with a message of like you're doing such an evil thing, like from students who care, like maybe makes them defensive, and they're like, well, like clearly, you know, they don't see reality because I'm not evil. I know I'm not evil. And so I would just, you know, thinking about the human aspect, I would like offer the thought that like, you know, just because you feel like you can like internally justify like Stanford remaining like really entrenched in fossil fuels does not mean like objectively like you're not doing an awful thing for the world. And so you can be a good person and like still be making like really bad choices and like still be thinking with this like institutional logic that isn't actually like seriously sitting with the fact that like if like our children and our children's children are gonna live on like a habitable earth, like we have to like stop what we're doing now, and it can't be like this slow like incremental change from the inside. Like we really have to like, because like even if they have like R&D on like, you know, fossil fuel capture or whatever, like these companies are just continuing to do what they're doing. They're continuing to do what's profitable, and like nothing about the way the economy or world is structured is going to disincentivize them from doing that, unless like institutions like Stanford, you know, stand up and say you have to stop. And so yeah, I would just like encourage them to like think about the ways their stated values and like the institution's stated values like don't align at all with like what they're doing. And yeah, like listen to students and like engage with students on like why we think the things we think, and like, you know, maybe move from there.
Stanford needs to divest from fossil fuels. Stanford needs to protect the communities that students come from. We need a tire shift in how we see the world. We need to shift to ideals of reciprocity, and sustainability. We need to shift in a lot of ways, and that's going to be uncomfortable. That's going to be hard, and if we're going to actually make a genuine investment into the world we want to see, we need to do hard things. Stanford needs to do hard things.
Despite all of the sort of negative things probably I've just said about Stanford, I really love this place. It's a strange, bifurcated place with many different faces, and I think there are amazing people here. There's so much kindness, so much care. There could be more, but amongst especially particular folks, I think there's just such a great sense of community and belonging. And so I really like this place in a lot of ways. It would mean so much to see so much power and privilege be used for the right kinds of things. And that would just create a beautiful domino effect, I think, in a positive direction. It just takes some courage. It just takes a bit of risk, but that risk isn't as high when you've got, you know, a huge endowment and a lot of donors and a lot of power and access. As I mentioned with the previous question, I think it takes some courage to speak out against the status quo. The status quo hasn't been working for the majority of people out there. Something's got to change. We can't continue to clutch our pearls and pretend as if the world around Stanford doesn't exist. The world around Stanford does exist, and Stanford only exists because of the sacrifice of so many people, the unwilling sacrifice of so many people. So to the Board of Trustees, I would say, please have some courage. Have some courage to say what needs to be said. Say the right thing. Have the courage to look inward and think outside of the box. Like, really think outside of the box. I'm not talking about some sort of, I don't know, economic innovation or something like that. I'm thinking, really think, how can we change the structures within which we live?